Hello there, welcome back to another MLex special background podcast, tailor-made for our LexisNexis colleagues in Australia and, of course, our subscribers in both Australia and New Zealand. My name is James Panichi. I'm a Melbourne-based senior editor at MLex, part of our Asia-Pacific Bureau, which is based in Hong Kong. It's great to have your company today. We always look forward to these informal catch-ups. They're always good fun. It's a chance for us to remind ourselves of what we've been up to over the past 6 or so months. It all happens so fast sometimes that it becomes a bit of a blur. And if this is the first such podcast that you've listened to, let me remind you that MLex is a LexisNexis media company. We produce independent journalism covering a handful of policy areas. In Australia and New Zealand, our coverage tends to focus on what, in US English, we refer to as antitrust matters. That's essentially competition law, which includes its enforcement and its application to mergers and acquisitions. We cover data privacy and security in all of its many manifestations. We have clearly so much to talk about on that front today, given the recent developments in Australia. We also report on anti-bribery and corruption and anti-money laundering, both legislative developments and the application of Australian laws. Now, these are 3 policy areas that have offered some quite lively moments for us over the recent months, and our Sydney-based reporter Laurel Henning has been at the centre of most of our recent coverage, and it's great to talk to you as always, Laurel.
Good to be with you, James.
Now, let's maybe kick off our chat with your recent work on antitrust penalty increases. This is something that we've been covering forever, or so it would seem, at least since 2018, maybe not forever. But the reason why we've had to cover it for so long is that the competition regulator, which is the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which we'll refer to as ACCC, well, the ACCC has been clamouring for tougher penalties, and it has been feuding, albeit very politely, but it has nonetheless been feuding with federal courts over their reluctance to impose tougher penalties. Now, the reason why they care about this is, of course, the issue of deterrence. So unless penalties are commensurate with the crime, there's no way of deterring others that might be planning to engage in anti-competitive behaviour, or at least that is the argument that the ACCC has always put forward. Well, it looks like that the regulator has finally got what it wanted, right?
That's right, James. This is the end of a long campaign, as you mentioned, for the ACCC, as well as a win for the, well, not so recently elected now Australian Labor government in terms of delivering on a key campaign promise that they made in terms of competition penalties specifically. Now, the ACCC managed to get government to include consumer penalty increases alongside the initially proposed competition law increase. So that was really a specific win for the regulator. But as you say, this has been a long drawn-out campaign for them. This new legislation would see judges have access to, it's specifically the increase in maximum penalties available. So it's not necessarily penalties across the board, but we're talking about the maximum penalties available to a judge when they hand down their decision. That's what's been increased, and it's been increased 5 times higher than they were previously for companies. So judges now have at their disposal 3 options, basically, when it comes to setting down corporate fines. So that would be the greatest of the following: either a flat maximum penalty of $50 million, 30% of turnover during the period of the breach, of the breaching conduct, or 3 times the value derived from that relevant breach. So previously that was a flat maximum of $10 million, 10% of annual turnover as well. And that's, as I mentioned, that's for companies. When you look at individuals, maximum penalties have also increased. So they've gone up from $500,000 to $2.5 million. And these are all really substantial increases. And I think as one lawyer crucially pointed out to you, I believe, that, you know, if you've got a company, 30% of a company's turnover, if that's a prolonged period of time, that's potentially wiping out a company. Now, obviously, I'm not going to set up my violin strings for companies behaving badly, but just to point out the significance of these penalties and their increases. Crucially, I think there's no direction that penalties must go up. That's not in the legislation. That the legislation says you judges now have to use these tougher maximum penalties that are at your disposal. But of course, that's what we're expecting to happen. We have spoken to some lawyers who thought this was way beyond excessive as an increase, and that coverage is obviously available to our subscribers. But the regulator is adamant that companies not see any penalty simply as a well-known quote, the cost of doing business.
And Laurel, it really comes down to the usual problem, though, for the ACCC, because if a company behaving badly were to, employ a violinist to go and give us some sad, tear-jerking music, they would do it at the time of sentencing because there's nothing to stop the judges from imposing a relatively small penalty, and that in a way would sort of undo all of this work that the ACCC has been so eager to promote.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting case that's been going on before this penalty increase was introduced that's just worth highlighting, and that's a consumer lawsuit involving Uber, and that proposed penalty was agreed upon between the ACCC and Uber. They agreed on the penalty that the company should face. They went to the judge, and the judge said, "Oh, I don't know about this. It feels like you're just suggesting this enormous fine because it's a tech company. I need to see evidence for the conduct. I need to see evidence for the people affected," and so forth. And so maybe he'll still side with them, but he needed more evidence for that, and we're waiting for that decision. But I think that's an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, indeed. Now, Australia has been rocked recently by revelations that two very significant companies had fallen victim to hackers and an enormous amount of data had been breached. The two companies in question are Singtel Optus, which is the country's second largest telecommunications company, and also Medibank Private, which is a private health insurance company. And just for possible US listeners here, Australia has a public health system, but you're able to take out additional private hospital coverage for certain things. And Medibank is indeed one such private insurance provider. Now, the breaches took place against a particular backdrop in Australia, right, Laurel? So what we're talking about at the moment, what we have been talking about for quite some time, is the planned overhaul of the country's now very much dated 1988 Privacy Act. So what's the state of play on that front?
Yeah, so just to also give a little bit of a summary as to why these two data breaches have really grabbed national attention particularly, I think that's for two reasons. First of all, the number of people affected. So 9.8 million people saw their data at least impacted from the Optus breach, and 9.7 million people have suffered the same with Medibank. Plus, part of the Optus data was published by a cyber criminal, but then in the Medibank case, we saw ransomware threats were acted on over a period of days, and that became a real talking point. Now, these are obviously by no means the only companies to face challenges in Australia when it comes to cybersecurity and hackers. There's been a huge number of data breaches just this year, I think, including companies such as supermarket operator Woolworths or DIY retailer Bunnings. I'm sure you're familiar with both of those. But these are the two that have really grabbed attention, perhaps for political reasons.
Well, I was going to say that, Laurel, because, I mean, they're clearly the breadth of the breach and the fact that almost everyone in Australia would be chances are that almost everyone would be affected by this. I know that my father, for example, was affected by the Medibank private breach. So that is a real political headache, right? Because angry constituents are going, no doubt, to their local members of parliament and just saying, why aren't you regulating this a little bit better? Why aren't you doing something about this?
Yeah, I think there are some key questions raised, particularly over why do we have to hand over the data that we hand over, and why were these companies, particularly in the case of Optus, some of that data was, I think, 20 years old. Why were these companies holding on to that? And there are meant to be principles in existing privacy law that would say that that's not allowed, but they're not enforced. And so also, if you've got a good set of in-house lawyers, you can argue that there's a legitimate business case perhaps for keeping this kind of data, even if it would boggle my mind as to what exactly that would be. But crucially, as you mentioned, these data breaches, particularly Optus and Medibank, have sort of spurred the government on to take action that was long overdue on the Privacy Act review. So,
well, that's right. I mean, there may well be a good business case to be put forward to say, look, we need to keep people's personal sensitive medical data for over 20 years, but that needs to be regulated. I mean, that's where the the limitations of the existing Privacy Act actually are highlighted.
Yeah, so let's go into that Privacy Act review a little bit. So it began in 2020 and it's just been incredibly slow. I think we've mentioned this probably on a previous podcast that we've done of this style, that there have been multiple consultations and there were already proposals on the table before the Labour government came into office to increase maximum penalties for privacy legislation. But it was only really these recent data breaches that meant that legislation got pushed through in the last month or so. So maximum privacy penalties have now been increased commensurate to the penalties that we were talking about before with the consumer and competition law breaches. And there's also new information sharing powers for the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC. So now that if they are notified and they are investigating something, they can communicate that with other national regulators, which is meant to help these kinds of huge investigations that involve many regulators and enforcement agencies in tracking down these cyber criminals, in stopping this data getting out to the extent that we've seen in these two instances. Now, what that means, of course, is that we've got part of the Privacy Act sort of sitting in 2022 in modern day and other parts firmly placed in the past. There's this small business exemption, for example, for companies with an annual turnover of less than $3 million. Now, that just doesn't fly in today's economy, where if you've got a small business operation, you are probably still handling today a lot of consumer data. And that's a real priority for the OAIC to get rid of that exemption.
Well, that's right. And there's a clear need for an overarching and consistent privacy law in Australia, in the same way that there was in New Zealand. And you covered the New Zealand, the revamping and the remaking of the New Zealand Privacy Act very diligently. Just remind me, how many years ago was it now? It was a couple of years ago, right? Yeah,
a couple of years ago. So that came into force at the end of 2020. So we would have been covering the development of that legislation probably for a couple of years before that.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's clearly a good case there for Australia to move ahead with its revamp of its Privacy Act. Now, moving on to the world of digital platforms now, and it has been a particularly busy couple of weeks for you, Laurel, because you coordinated the work of the members of our Asian team for a regional wrap of the kinds of regulatory challenges that are on the horizon for digital giants in the Asia-Pacific region. There's a lot going on at the moment, and nowhere more so than in Australia. The ACCC has released its most recent report as part of a 5-year digital platform probe. This is of particular interest to our subscribers around the world, because many of the issues that have been ventilated in Australia at the moment are in fact quite influential and could perhaps give an indication of where regulation may be heading in other jurisdictions as well. So tell me something about the new digital platform report that came out recently and what it means for companies like Apple, Facebook, Google and other digital players in Australia.
Or, of course, Meta, as it's now known.
Oh, Meta, indeed.
But,
Oops, yeah, Meta, yes.
That's right, James. And thanks, by the way, for the little report plug. It's a great showcase of our coverage across the region, and it's available on the sunny side with a paywall, so listeners should definitely go and check that out. The ACCC's digital platform report, it comes at a really interesting time. Not only does Australia have a new government, as we've already mentioned, but this is also a real temperature check for how the ACCC's new chair, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, is going to address these big tech issues moving forward. So the regulator has obviously been working on digital platforms for some years now. We saw the initial digital platforms inquiry conclude in 2019. The outcome of that inquiry was that the government called for this 5-year long report, along with other things that the ACCC has since worked on. And so now we're at that halfway mark, as you rightly point out. And the ACCC has very much looked to other jurisdictions in this report, particularly the EU, the UK, and also Japan, and suggesting introducing these sorts of codes of conduct, as it were, to address the concerns it has, particularly when it comes to competition. And those concerns are very much focused among sort of app store markets, search, and social media, very much affecting the 3 companies that you mentioned previously. The ACCC has also recommended consumer law changes to tackle things such as online scams, which are becoming an increasingly important issue for the ACCC. It's something that Cass Gottlieb talks about a lot whenever she speaks publicly. Now, the change in tone in this report, I think, takes the regulator from where it was in 2019, when it was really very much out ahead of this global debate on big tech, where it was banging the drum of world first regulation and reports, creating things like the media bargaining code when nothing like that really existed in the world, to now taking on a sort of more measured view. I think that's reflective of Cass Gottlieb at the head of the ACCC as well. And she actually told me in a recent interview as well that with these codes of conduct, the regulator is expecting that because of legislation now in place overseas or very soon to enter into force overseas, thinking particularly the EU, the UK, the regulator expects that many platforms might already exceed any minimum standards that the ACCC sets in these codes of conduct. So that's a real change of tone, I think, from the ACCC, and also one that shows it's really listening to what's happening overseas and learning from that, I think. Now, I don't think that should mean that the regulator will stop taking the consumer lawsuits that it's taken in the past, or is now having a soft touch approach to competition law issues. Not at all. I think it's just perhaps more cautious and more measured.
And I mean, not to be flippant about this, but it is also true that with COVID travel restrictions now gone, it may well be that there are more ACCC officials travelling overseas to international conferences and realising perhaps that all of those things that they would have previously tagged as world first, groundbreaking discoveries, they're actually realising that a lot of regulators around the world are thinking about the exact same things, and perhaps they're a little bit more cautious than they had been before.
Yeah, this is the post-COVID realisation, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. But now, look, returning to the world of capital C competition, last time we did one of these podcasts, we were very much preoccupied with the ACCC's enforcement agenda, which was targeting cartels and anti-competitive behaviour under both civil and criminal cartel legislation in Australia. Although for criminal matters, of course, the enforcement is handled by the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, the CDPP. That's Australia's federal prosecutor. Now, so when we spoke about this last time, the ACCC was still licking its wounds after some high-profile court defeats, and we covered that quite extensively last time, so we no need to go through that humbling experience for the ACCC yet again. But since we had that conversation, there have now been a few wins for the ACCC, and the agency, as you mentioned before, has a new chair, Gina Cass Gottlieb, who's replacing the very much outspoken Rod Sims. So let's go through some of the recent developments here, starting with Vena Money Transfer. What do we need to know about that company and the outcome of that prosecution?
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think last time we recorded this podcast, we were setting up for covering weeks and weeks of jury trials in this case, and alas, that has not come to bear for our coverage, but hooray for the people involved. The CDPP launched the Vena Money Transfer prosecution back in 2019. So this has been going on for quite some time, and the case really centred on this a group of family-run Vietnamese foreign exchange businesses in the suburbs of Sydney and also Melbourne. There were 5 individuals as well as at least one company. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because you covered a lot of the earlier details of this case.
Yes, no, it was just one company charged. The others were not charged, although individuals from the other companies were charged.
Exactly, yes. Right. So just Vena Money Transfer, and then 5 individuals were facing criminal cartel charges. 4 of those 5 pleaded guilty. So their cases were sort of over and done in June, which is when Federal Court of Australia Judge Wendy Abraham imposed a $1 million fine on the company, Vena Money Transfer, while sentencing 4 of the 5 individuals to suspended jail terms of up to 2 years and 4 months. Now, Jamie Lee, the 5th individual involved in the lawsuit and the son of the owner of Vena Money Transfer, was the only one of the accused to decide to fight the charges that were facing him. But in September, the charges against Lee were dropped. Now, that's the 3rd time a case like this has been scrapped ahead of a jury trial. And the reasons for it being dropped really came down to a question of evidence. There had been a point where lawyers were arguing that they wanted to really base their case on a large body of evidence that had been used in the sentencing of the other individuals. And that was a situation that was facing a lot of opposition from Jamie Lee's legal team. In the end, the judge, Abraham, she never had to make a decision on that dispute because the prosecution said, fine, we'll slim down our case. But then about a week or two later, they just dropped the case entirely. So this has come up before, an issue of evidence with the CDPP bringing cases on the ACCC's behalf. And it's also a case that's faced quite a lot of criticism in terms of the targets here, because I think a lot of lawyers are sort of saying that this is a small family-run business. Is this really the kind of target? Are these people also really the kinds of targets? This isn't the first time that this has come up either, and we can get into that the ACCC should be going after with criminal cartel charges. Should these prosecutions instead actually be saved for truly the most egregious examples of cartel conduct? We're talking that really textbook, smoky backroom. We're going to take advantage of the market for our own gain very overtly, and an agreement between competitors to do so, knowing that they will harm consumers in the making of that agreement.
The other thing is that the people who were ultimately handed sentences in the Vena money transfer case received suspended sentences, so none of them are actually going to jail. And that also could be seen, I suppose, as a defeat for the ACCC that desperately needs to send out that sort of cautionary tale message to people that might be tempted to engage in a criminal cartel.
Yeah, that's hard, isn't it? Because I think obviously nothing sends a message stronger than someone being put behind bars. That goes without saying. That said, a lot of people who have been involved in these cases, even where the case hasn't gone to trial, in multiple instances their careers are over, they're ending up in multi-million dollars of debt in defending themselves. This is not a situation, even in cases that haven't gone to trial, without significant human impact and deterrence.
Now that brings us to another cartel case involving a company called Bingo Industries. Most Australians would recognise the name from skips that they see around town. By skips we obviously mean those large bins, those large containers used to collect waste materials. Both the company and its managing director had been facing criminal charges, and it has been a relatively significant case. This was in fact the third Australian company, at least, to plead guilty to criminal cartel offences.
Yes, if we take into account local court pleas plus federal court pleas, this is the third time that this had happened. Still, it was a significant moment, as we've seen two cases now in quick succession where companies have immediately pleaded guilty. So they've bypassed the local court process that we've seen in contested hearings and headed straight to the federal court for sentencing. Also, what that will mean further down the track is that early plea is really taken into account by the presiding judge as well when they make their decision. We're expecting to see sentencing hearings against the company, Bingo, and its former managing director and chief executive officer, Daniel Tartak, in March next year. Federal prosecutors had alleged that in mid-2019, Bingo had agreed with its competitors, Aussie Skip Bin Services and Aussie Skips Recycling, to fix and increase prices for the supply of bins and the provision of waste processing services for building and demolition waste in Sydney. So this is more that textbook agreement between two companies that I think lawyers were expecting to see among the criminal offences.
Now, Laurel, more recently you have been following a case of an architectural firm called Ashton Raggett McDougall. It's a civil case, but it is nonetheless an interesting one. It involves a project in Darwin, which is a city on the tropical northern coast of Australia, and it involves bid rigging allegations. What do we need to know?
Well, basically, never write an email, James, that you don't want to appear in a court of law is my main takeaway from covering this case. It is about, as you mentioned, Ashton Raggett McDougall, and it centres on emails that its previous employee, Anthony Allen, the company's former managing director, sent to around 8 competitors of the company relating to this specific project. So, again, the company looks set to settle this case, and Allen could well do the same from what we've heard recently. So the company, which actually trades as ARM Architecture, but I'll refer to it perhaps as ARM, had won this initial part of a Darwin-based project. It was valued at $250 million, and it was meant to be in Darwin's central business district. It was funded by the federal government, as well as Charles Darwin University, the leading tertiary institution in Australia's Northern Territory. Now, in September 2020, the university issued a tender for the second phase of that project. So having initially won the first phase, there was a second part. the university issued a tender, and the ACCC has alleged that from the time ARM submitted to that tender for the first phase, it had been aware that the second phase would face a further tender process, and it did not like that. At one point, it had considered approaching the university to request it not issue a second tender. It didn't do that in the end, but what it did instead was, as I say, Allen, this man, Anthony Allen, decided to send emails to his competitors that allegedly detail him sort of requesting that 8 of his competitors not also bid for this second tender.
OK, so moral for the tale, dance like no one is watching, but email like a judge is reading.
That's right.
So, and on that note, Laurel, we might wrap up this special edition of the podcast. Great talking as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure.
Laurel Henning is MLex's Sydney-based senior reporter. She works alongside our Canberra-based reporter Daniel Burden. And don't forget that our website has the very best and the very latest of our reporting and analysis. Just go to mlexmarketinsight.com. That's mlexmarketinsight.com. There's a tab there called News Hub. Just click on that and you'll have a good sample of the stories covered by our team of reporters around the world. There's also a nice archive of podcasts, which can be a good first point of contact for our coverage. And that's it for today's special podcast. It's always great to have a chance to showcase our Australian coverage, so thank you so much for listening. Don't hesitate to reach out to the Australian team here at LexisNexis if you have any questions about the work that we do. From me, James Panichi, and everyone at MLex, thank you for your company. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.